Since we're able to pay attention and we're very thorough and able to get through things, Thoreau, especially Thoreau, we're reading the entire journals of Henry David Thoreau, from beginning to end, 7,000 pages. Actually, just kidding. We're just reading, finishing reading to page 436 in chapter 10 of A Life. So we're not doing a thorough reading through Thoreau's entire journal. Not just yet. Because if it's considered a masterpiece by the people who know it, but how would you know it's a masterpiece unless you did read it? Page 436, the night of July 10th, 1859. This book draws on the journals. A cold snap, and we're talking about a cold snap. We're during our own cold snap, cracked the ground open with explosions that jarred the house. They used to have like cold cracks in the ground. It's like an earthquake. Next morning, Henry checked the thermometer on his way out the door. 20 below at 6 a.m. It's cold there. 20 below. He was en route to Cambridge, having been summoned to a test to Brasilei's Frost's will. Remember how he had to do testimony as a surveyor for wills and the train was full of talk about the strange cracking of the ground. Henry took note. His thoughts must have been somber. 3 years before, Henry and his father had witnessed Frost's last will and testament. Now the Reverend had succumbed to consumption, and Henry was doing his work alone because consumption was taking his father too. 2 days later, he wrote Harry Blake to postpone his lecture in Worcester. In Ohio, it's called Worcester or Worcester. John Thoreau was too weak to join the family downstairs. Even a brief trip was out of the question as Henry dedicated himself to nursing his father. For a time, John hoped to see another spring, but toward the end of January, when it became clear his hope was vain, he reconciled himself to death and took leave of his family. Several times it turned out, until he was expressing impatience at the delay. Do you think that really old people try to make it to the next spring each year? Would you try to make it to the next spring? When the end finally came, they were clustered around his bed, attending closely, and he was gone almost before we were aware of it. His surviving son mounted the stairs to the attic, turned to a clean page in his journal, and wrote across the center. February 3rd, 5 minutes before 3 p.m., Father died. Of all Henry's friends, the only one who had taken the time to know his father was Daniel Ricketson. Henry mailed him a copy of his father's obituary, and Rickoltson immediately returned warm words of consolation. John Thoreau had been a real embodiment of honest virtue, as well as a true gentleman of the old school, who reminded him of his own father. You think most fathers are from the old school? Seems like fathers are, in a way, always old school. Both bore upon their countenances the impress of care and sorrow, of revelation of the experiences of life written in the most legible characters. Thoreau responded with a eulogy. His father had been an artisan, and almost an artist, who always studied how to make a good article rather than sell a poorer one for ready gain. He was a pencil maker. As if he labored for a higher end, he did support writing in a way, didn't he, with his pencils? Do you think the pencils support journaling? No one, he added in his journal, knew Concord's history and people better than his father. You think if we had an original Thoreau pencil, we'd be able to write in our journals. Who had been part of it for more than 50 years. He belonged in a particular sense to the village street. Loved to sit in the shops or at the post office and read the daily papers. Do you like to just sit on the steps of the post office and read the paper? Everyone else had come later and kept more aloof. It occurred to Henry that of the four who had signed Reverend Frost's will, he alone was still alive. How swiftly at last, but unnoticed, a generation passes away. That's why he worried about making sure he didn't realize that he hadn't lived his life. So he went to Walden to make sure he didn't wake up one day to realize he hadn't lived. If you read Walden, it might save you. With this thought, Henry's letter to Dickinson drew to a close, but in his journal he wrote on, by some obscure link, his father's death called up the deaths of American Indians. Henry rose up in indignation. Bemoaning the California gold diggers who shot an Indian, quote, as a wild beast, unquote, and the inhumanity of historians who were every bit as lethal, only wielding a, quote, a pen instead of a rifle. These intertwined losses felt deeply personal. Quote, I perceive that we partially die ourselves through sympathy at the death of each of our friends or near relatives, unquote. Do you think that we die if a relative dies? I guess if you're one unit, if all is one. He continued, quote, each such experience is an assault on our vital source. Unquote, his only defense was to write and keep writing. Sentences might lie, quote, dead at first, but, quote, when all are arranged, some life and color will be reflected on them from the mature and successful lines. The lines that, quote, pulsate with fresh life. Do you think you should pulsate with fresh life? Slowly the writer breathes life into the rubble-stone and foundation of his first gropings, finds his way to his theme to make one pertinent and just observation. Do you think we should make one pertinent and just observation a day, at least? If we just buy one thing, then cook one thing, and then eat one thing, and then make one pertinent and just observation. His writing must awaken the dying, give them voice, call the sleepers awake. In March he picked up the usual late winter crop of stone fruit, newly exposed arrowheads, humanity inscribed on the face of the earth. Footprints? No, he corrected himself, quote, rather a mind print left everywhere of the oldest man. Well, I haven't found many arrowheads. Did I ever find an arrowhead? Object says, mind prints. Thoreau's observations were linking up. In April, he drafted a ringing condemnation of the fur trade. A, quote, pitiful business, unquote. No one wanted to take that fur coat. Seems like at the garage sale there was a nice fur coat. Did you want the fur coat? Nobody wants a fur coat. It seems like that's weird. Pitiful business run by, quote, famous companies which enjoy a profitable monopoly and control a large portion of the earth's surface, ferreting out small animals for fashionable hats and the luxurious trimmings of judicial robes, leaving the, quote, bare red carcasses on the banks of the streams throughout all British America. I think the British have a bloody history. Tawan and Polis, Maine's woods and Concord's plowed fields, the trade in tortoise shell and the animal skins, quote, in such a snarl and condemnation do we live that it is almost impossible to keep one's skirts clean. Why, quote, our sugar and cotton are stolen from the slave. Do you think we should acquire sugar from slaves? And what about the cotton? Or should we have plastic clothing with polyester? We could get fair trade cotton. When he took up a handful of soil, he found it ash-colored from Indian fires, with pieces of campfire coal still visible. Quote, we do literally plow up the hearts of a people and plant in their ashes, unquote. Thoreau was a haunted man. He and everyone he knew were all implicated. The evil of slavery, the damnation of the Indian, the global traffic in animal parts, the debasement of nature, the enclosure of the ancient commons, the threads of modern global economy. This is a very modern. We're reading about modern global economy, current issues. This is a current issue talk. We're spinning him and everyone around him into a dehumanizing web of destruction. Tawan's arrow, planted in his pocket 22 years before, was bearing fruit in the most ominous way. Hmm. You feel this is like an environmentalist TED Talk? Admire. How did Thoreau find time to write at all? His father's death meant he was now head of the household. The man without property suddenly had a net worth of $5,500. Thoreau now has $5,000. With legal responsibility for his mother, his sisters Louisa and Sophia Dunbar. Sophia. How do you pronounce it? And his sister Sophia. He was also in charge. She is the Thoreau in skirt. She is like Thoreau, but in a skirt. He was also in charge of the family graphite business, submitting bills, dunning for late payments, paying employees, contractors, managing a constant flow of orders, inquiries, and bills, which he flipped over to scribbled drafts of wild fruits. Huh. He purchased and studied the businessman's assistant and legal guide, and he sought improvements to the industrial process. Seems he's like into operations research. For a poet, it's unusual to be into operations research. That's strange. Following his assistant, Warren Mills's suggestion, he walked the woods in Acton, searching for a millstone. Stones thought Mills would be better than the iron balls they used. Thoreau found a good one, tried it out, and agreed. Affairs multiplied. In May, he helped Emerson organize his brother Bulkeley's funeral. In August, he studied the Yellow House for the September muster of 6,000 Massachusetts militiamen, which packed all the boarding houses and clogged the main street with troops, camp followers, ragtags, and pickpockets. On his way to buy a lock for the front door, he was told the governor was coming to, quote, "Then I must buy a second lock for the back door," unquote. He quote, "Dare, should we buy 2 locks if the governor's coming?" He's funny. In October, he was called to court to testify in a lawsuit against Aunt Marie, his neighbor, who, claiming right away through Maria's yard, tore down her fence and erected a spite fence. A spite fence of her own, 18 inches from Maria's front door and windows. Maria won. Throughout the year, he felt pressed and anxious with all those lawsuits. That fall, he told Blake, starved for a good, long, philosophical letter, that he was, quote, too much like a businessman to write, besieged by irksome family concerns. Hmm. Hmm. I have many affairs to tend to and feel hurried these days, he fretted to his journal. I feel fatal, it felt fatal. To create art, time must stand still. Quote, the artist cannot be in a hurry. Do you think an artist cannot be in a hurry? Can an artist be in a hurry? Or is it not able to create art?
I don't know how you get up and you can sing in the morning.
Well, one way to avoid besieging of irksome family concerns is to get up before the family gets up. I can be alone in the morning. Irksome. Affairs beyond his family multiplied as well. On March 28, 1859, the president of Harvard appointed Thoreau to the Harvard Committee for Examination in Natural History. The president of Harvard, he appointed Thoreau. Isn't that kind of getting some respect? Do you think Thoreau got some respect? This put him in a select company of New England naturalists who met annually in mid-July under the direction of Asher Gray to conduct the final examination of Harvard's sophomores in botany. You think we should just take botany? I think we studied the wrong thing. If we had taken botany and learned nutrition and learned how to cook, could have taken botany, learned how to cook, and learned nutrition, how to clean, we wouldn't have wasted all our time. Thoreau was now officially part of the scientific establishment. In April, he performed his own practical lesson in applied botany. For 2.5 days, with the help of 2 men and a horse and a cart, he planted 400 young pines. There's a picture where Rich is, for 4-H, is planting pines on the Smith farm as windbreak. You see, if you don't like the wind, you just plant pines. It's a windbreak. Rich Smith for 4-H planted 400 young pines, each carefully selected from sunny pastures, dug up with a good root ball and set in the ground with his own hand on 2 acres of land where his house once stood. A week later, he returned and set out for good measure 100 more trees, 200 old English larches. His little trees grew into a fine forest of colonnaded trunks, an evergreen memorial that survived well into the 20th century. It's a good memorial for somebody, is to plant trees. What kind of trees did you have in Greece? Thoreau, working on lecturing as well, worked on lecturing on January 1559. Quote, Autumnal tints. This is about like the fall with the leaves falling. Was nearly finished. On February 22nd, he broke away from his grieving family long enough to read it to the Worcester circle, holding up as illustration a large, handsome scarlet oak leaf displayed on a board. Their initial reaction disappointed him. Someone remarked he had seen plenty of autumn leaves. Thank you very much. Why would I go to a lecture about autumn leaves? I've seen a lot myself. But Dickinson told a friend he missed, quote, one of the best lectures of the season. Caroline Healey Dalls thought the lecture was charming, though Thoreau was not, an impression she modified that December when she delivered Lives of Noted Women at the Concord Lyceum, a literary lecture by a woman who was a novelty, and Emerson laughed at Thoreau, who thought women never had anything to say, would certainly not come. Soon after she began, Dalls saw a working man in a green jacket enter and sit on the back bench by the door. As she continued, he edged nearer and nearer until she lost sight of him. It was, of course, Thoreau. "But this woman has something to say," unquote, he replied to Emerson's ripping before inviting Doll to stay an extra day with the Thoreaus. It was, she wrote years later, a day, quote, "filled to the brim with charming talk," unquote. Her admiration for Thoreau reads like an Emily Dickinson poem. Quote, "His tongue, like a Damascus blade, was hardly fit for ordinary use, but it shaped or severed at a blow the substances which most weapons do only tear." Did you get that? His tongue, like a Damascus blade, was hardly fit for ordinary use, but it shaped or severed at a blow the substances which most weapons do only tear. After staying, it sounds like Emily Dickinson, after staying overnight with Blake in Worcester. It's not Emily, it's written by, it said it's like an Emily Dickinson poem. It's written by Caroline Healey Dall, D-A-L-L. See, Henry, he showed up at her lecture in the back dressed like a workman. Remember, Henry was a handy man and a practical man who planted trees and hiked around. He'd get his hands dirty in the dirt. That's why he had good immunity. After staying overnight with Blake in Worcester, he read, quote, the Allagash in East Branch, quote, to the same gathering. Thoreau's new work was finding an audience. A week later, on March 2nd, he repeated Autumnal Tints at the Concord Lyceum to constant, spontaneous burst of laughter and applause. Seems like the lecture has different results in different places.
What lecture was the second? This one?
Autumnal Tints. It's about just leaves. What would you say in a lecture about dead leaves? Their energy encouraged him as he wrote the next day. Quote, the lecturer will read best those parts of his lecture which are best heard. So I guess you can try your lecture out. You should have a response-based lecture. You could measure the response and read the parts that people like. A week later, he read it again at the Emersons to his circle of young people, where Alcott, as usual, was one of his best hearers. Quote, a leaf becomes a cosmos, a Genesis in paradise preserved, he marveled. He read it one last time that season on April 26, returning to Lynn as a last-minute substitute for a lecturer who had canceled. The local newspaper reported his audience listened with deep attention. Remember, they don't have television or TED Talks or YouTube, or they do read books. I guess you have to read books, or listen to audiobooks or listen to YouTube or write books or whatever. The reason we make fun of these things is because in the highest level you don't actually read or listen to anything, you just meditate full time. He would read this hymn to life in the face of death one last time. In December 1860, in what would be his last lecture. Wow, last lecture. Thoreau's multiplying responsibilities did not free him from surveying. On the contrary, he spent much of 1859 in the field, and for every hour in the field there were more hours at his desk drawing his painstakingly accurate plans. "It's the hardest work I can do," unquote, he wrote Thatcher that August. Quote, "While following it, I need to go to Moosehead every afternoon and camp out every night." He said it's like when he does his surveying work, he has to go to Moosehead to get away from it. You know what that means? In his mind, he goes back to Maine and camps out. We could go there in thought to Moosehead. Or you want to go to Moosehead? Rangeley. You could go to Maine. I don't know why we don't go to Maine. We went to Maine? We could go to Maine. We should take a summer vacation to Maine. The Maine trip. To Blake, another dreamer with a family to provide for, he commiserated that worlds don't run by themselves but must be constantly oiled and
Boston, is that in Maine?
goaded along. What?
Boston.
No. Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a good state. Everything begins in Massachusetts, really. In short, they have got to carry on 2 farms at once. The farm on the earth and the farm in the mind. See, he's kind of like a farmer who's intellectual, huh? He's a Renaissance man in a way. Huh? Maintaining a family and estate was easy compared with maintaining the children of your brain, yet that was the only way to keep up the power of original thought. Quote, "Keep up the fires of thought and all will go well." Only once before had those 2 farms. Those are the 2 farms, one's the mind and one's the folded together into a single survey back in January 1846 when Thoreau had sounded the depths of Walden Pond. In the summer of 1859 he would again make those 2 farms one when his friends in the Concord Farmers Club approached him with the biggest commission he would ever undertake, the survey of the Concord River from East Sudbury all the way to the dam of Billerica Mills, only 22 miles in all. That's quite a job, though. You're going to survey the whole river for 22 miles? At stake was the future of Concord itself. They said that a lot of the organization of the town of Concord originates from Thoreau's surveys. So Thoreau's work is still very much a part of Concord. For generations, the Concord River's grassy meadows had been the heart of the valley's agricultural economy, kept fertile by spring floods in summers. The meadows grew into lush grasslands that curd into hay so rich that cows would turn away from the finest English hay whenever they heard its distinctive rustle. It's better than English hay. Manure from those cows fertilized the croplands, leaving the wooded uplands free for fuel and timber. An elegant, sustainable economy that had kept Concord Valley green for 2 centuries. But something was going wrong. Spring floods were rising too high, lingering too long, and returning in the fall. So already that messed up the environment. Thousands of acres of valuable grasslands had degenerated into immense, reeking, stagnant bogs of decaying vegetation. Quote, one uniform Dead Sea, unquote. As the farmers' petitions put it, the cause of this calamity was, they felt sure, the Middlesex Canal Company, which had built the dam in Billerica to power the Lowell textile mills. Recently, the company added a 3-foot riser, making a serious problem worse. The valley's farmers had had enough. In spring 1859, they formed the River Meadow Association and prepared to bring a lawsuit. Among them were most of Thoreau's closest Concord friends: Warren Mills, Simon Brown, Jacob Farmer, Sam Staples, Albert Stacy, Franklin Sanborn, Minot Pratt, and Edmund Hosmer, the townsmen of the land. They needed an expert witness, someone who knew the river intimately, who had witnessed and recorded the changes, and who understood what was at stake. Someone who could draw a map. They called on Henry Thoreau. He's like becoming mayor now. The mayor. On June 4th, 1859, Simon Brown and the 3 other men commissioned Henry to study and measure all the bridges from Wayland to Billica Dam. But soon Thoreau was hard at work, often assisted by Channing, who had resigned from the New Bedford Mercury. He paddled to every bridge, studied and measured it, looked up its history, its town records, and interviewed and corresponded with local informants. On June 24th, the Concord Township hired him to survey the entire riverbed. Thoreau paddled every inch of the river's 22 miles, measuring depths and breadths, noting sandbars and shallows and potential obstructions, charting the river's every meander, recording vegetation and noting flood zones, piling up scores of pages of notes and calculations. Emerson was bemused. Quote, Henry T. occupies himself with the history of the river, unquote, he wrote Elizabeth Hoare, quote, measures it, weighs it, strains it through a colander to all eternity. You think he's too detail-oriented? That's his job. The more Thoreau worked, the more the data spoke to him of the river as a grand human natural system. He could tell the day of the week by the height of the water, which rose and fell as the millers upstream went to work, left off for night, and kept the Sabbath. As he measured depths with his foot rule, he watched a heron measure them with its legs. He thought about erosion problems and stream flow, the gradual deposition of sand, the slow movements of sandbars, and the abrupt reshaping of shoreline and riverbed by weaving blocks of melting ice. He weighed the human history spoken by the stone bridges and studied the way the river wiggled itself into meanders, and the way willows and bulrushes found the places they liked best. He drew up a huge chart of all the bridges. Then he glued together heavy sheets of surveyor's cloth to make a roll nearly 7 feet long, upon which he enlarged a 1834 map of the river. On this base he recorded the grand sum of his findings, including an elevation of the Billerica Dam, showing the new flashboard that raised it another 3 feet, blocking the river's flow. In 22 miles he measured, the river dropped just over 4 feet, barely enough to keep it from reverting into one huge inland lake as it had been back in glacial times. The lawsuit went to trial on January 1860. One farmer testified the river was dammed at both ends and cursed in the middle. The Massachusetts legislature agreed, ordering the dam removed and damages paid. The next year, a state commission with an army of laborers and a budget of $10,000 repeated Thoreau's work, producing a map much like his own, but far more detailed, plus a massive report that concluded the dam was only one of many causes. Restoring the Concord River would require a massive re-engineering project. In 1862, the legislature reversed their earlier decision. It was too late to do anything. The farmers had lost. Weird. The flooding, which kept getting worse, was a fact of life. Today, the great meadows where Thoreau timed his summers by the hay market harvest is a great sheet of water fringed by cattails and crossed by dikes, a wildlife sanctuary for waterfowl. Only by orienting himself to the surrounding hills could Thoreau tell today where he was. No one knew then that the farmer's own actions, clear-cutting the forested hillsides and draining the swamps and bogs by croplands, had helped destroy the river meadows. Denuded hillsides could not hold runoff, and with no bogs to sponge it up, rainwater ran straight into the river. You know how we have a shortage of swamps now. How do you filter water? What a disaster. Now, they complained of the dam builders, but then the farmers have messed it up too. The more the river flooded and killed off the farmlands, the more farmers logged off the uphill lands to plant English hay and drained wetlands for new crops. In Thoreau's short lifetime, this vicious circle rewrote the Concord landscape. On October 14th, with the river survey nearly completed, Thoreau took an afternoon to visit his transplanted pines and larches. The little trees made sturdy green rows, and the withered autumn grasses budding well for the future. The next day, he walked up a hill to overlook the great meadows. As he watched the sun light up the red banners of distant forests, he returned to an old idea, quote, "Each town should have a park, or rather rather a primitive forest of 500 or 1,000 acres, where a stick should never be cut for fuel, a common possession forever for instruction and recreation. All Walden wood might have been preserved for our park forever, with Walden in its midst, unquote. He proposed in that park system. In Wild Fruits, he developed this idea into a proposal. Each town should have a committee appointed to see that the beauty of the town received no detriment, to preserve its rivers and forests and hills and cliffs for a higher use than, quote, dollars and cents, unquote. The town planners, quote, should have made the river available as a common possession forever, opening its banks to public walks and parks instead of allotting them off into private hands. Huh. I think they should have had a bike trail. Bike trails. Over the Maine woods, Thoreau had no influence. He had no influence in Maine, but in Concord his voice carried weight. On March 6, 1862, his friend Albert Stacy, the printer and bookseller and occasional postmaster, stood up in front of the Concord Farmers Club with Thoreau's proposal, quote, why should not every village have its public park of from 50 or 100 acres in extent, supported by public expense? Suppose we had such a park in Concord of 100 acres in extent, comprising hill and dale and watery scenery, beautifully laid out in walks and drives, a perfect arboretum of all the trees and shrubs that will grow in this vicinity. Would it not be the resort of the whole town? Would it not have a silent influence upon everyone, making us more social and genial, bringing out all the finer qualities which are inherent in the human character? He's like proposing a forest bathing. You think that they could bathe in the forest? Or they pick up the needed immunity from the biosphere? Thoreau was heard. His friends in the Concord Farmers Club put his ideas into practice. And soon his words reached beyond Concord as well, leaving traces in every American public park, places protected as a common possession forever, so that the commons might survive. We're talking about the commons. You know how some towns have a commons? Remember that town like Bedford, New York, where they used to graze the sheep in the commons? Well, we were reading about the park system. The town park creates a town park. I think this reading is about Thoreau creating a town park. What did happen in this reading? Creates the parks. Thoreau creates a town park. We're reading from Thoreau, A Life, and Henry surveys the Concord River and decides to help create all of the town parks in America. That's quite a feat, huh? Wow.